what I have given you is example sentences, and I've given them, since they are English sentences, I've given them to you on the handout. The talk, in a way, is not particularly new. What I'm trying to do is show why philosophers should be interested in the structure of language. If you like, it's why facts about language, facts about the logical structure of language, which are, in a way, the business of linguists, these facts have philosophical, if you like, metaphysical implications. So in a way, it's addressed to philosophers why they need to know something about the structure of language. The example sentences I'm going to use are from English, but the talk is not really about the structure of English, because the things that these English sentences mean are things that people ought to want to say anyway, so that whether a language does it the way English does it, whether a language does it in some completely different way, these are things that people need language to say, and therefore there has got to be an underlying structure to any language which allows people to say these things. There has to be an underlying structure which we can use for the purposes of ontology. And I want to begin by reading to you some quotations from a well-known British philosopher, G.E. Moore, who wrote an article in the journal called Mind in 1899. And Moore is talking about the relation between existence and truth. And he says, at one point, it is only maintained that existence is logically subordinate to truth. That's what he's trying to maintain, that existence is logically subordinate to truth. That truth cannot be defined by reference to existence, but existence only by reference to truth. When I say this paper exists, I must require that this proposition be true. And later he says, it is similarly impossible that truth should depend on a relation to existence or to an existent, since the proposition by which it is so defined must itself be true. And the truth of this can certainly not be established without vicious circle by exhibiting its dependence on an existent. A little later he says, an appeal to facts is useless, for in order that a fact may be made the basis of an argument, it must first be put in the form of a proposition, and moreover, this proposition must be supposed true. So Moore is telling us that if you want to know about ontology, if you want to know about what exists, you have to look at propositions which assert existence and look at their truth. And if you want to look at the logical structure of propositions, the only way in which you can have access to this would seem to be by looking at the logical structure of the languages which express them. And so that is the reason why I want to suggest that the structure of language is important to the metaphysical concerns of philosophers. And as I said, we are not interested here in saying what is the truth about English, or about Russian, or about any other particular natural language. We are interested in saying any language adequate for communication must be able to say these things. What is the logical structure of a language which can say these things? And in particular, I want to look at some work that I and Adrian Rini have been doing in recent years, and that is looking at the way English, and therefore most natural languages, have to be able to talk about time and have to be able to talk about modality. We have to say that certain things were once the case, or will be the case, or might have been the case. Whether a language has a tense system, as most Indo-European languages do, or whether it expresses temporal distinctions in some different way, we must be able to talk about time, and we must be able to talk about possibilities. Looking at another lesson from G.E. Moore, G.E. Moore once gave a very famous lecture called The Proof of an External World. And he said, look, how can I prove that there is an external world? And he held up two hands. He said, I have two hands. Here is one, here is one. And his point was that the truth of I have two hands must be something that is respected by any semantic theory. There are certain truths, if you like, such that if you deny those truths, then you are denying something which is, in effect, must be more certain than any argument that it's not. So Moore's point was that these obvious truths about the world must be more certain than any philosophical argument against them. And so the technique that I am talking about here is the technique of studying sentences, the structure of sentences, and I will particularly be thinking of sentences about time and modality, and looking at what are the tests which enable us to go from these ordinary non-philosophical truths to postulating a structure which gives us an ontology which tells us what sort of things have to exist in order to make sense of the logical structure of the things we want to say. Moore's example was sentence 1, I have two hands. But we can equally say, I didn't have two hands 100 years ago. In fact, I didn't even exist 100 years ago. That's sentence 2. Sentence about time. Sentence 3, if I had an arm amputated, I would no longer have two hands. That's another sentence here. You might think that there are certain sentences that don't make any reference to time or modality. One might say, sentence 4, there is a sideboard to the left of the dining room door at 57 Stanley Avenue, Palmerston North, New Zealand, at 12:20 p.m. New Zealand Standard Time on the 4th of August, 2006. You can see when I was first thinking about these things. You might say that that sentence doesn't have any reference to time and modality. It does, of course, have an explicit date, but you might say there's no modality involved here, and yet, of course, looking at that sentence 4, we have sentence 5. 4 would still have been true even if I had not been at home then. So even though 4 itself may not seem to be a modal sentence, it has modal implications because we can make statements about what would have been the case, that sentence would still have been true even in certain counterfactual situations. I was, in fact, at home that day. We can then move on to sentences about entities that many philosophers will repudiate. I know philosophers who say numbers don't exist. But if you say, do numbers exist? One answer is, but look, surely among the what are called Moorean facts. Moorean facts are these truths, like 1, that we must always accept. It seems to be a Moorean fact that is 7, there is an even number between 3 and 5, or 8. There is no way I can jump 2 meters. And if that's true, if there is an even number between 3 and 5, it looks as though numbers must exist. If you ask, do numbers exist in any other sense, if we follow the philosopher Rudolf Carnap, you would say what you are really asking is, should we adopt a language in which we can speak numerically? And Carnap said that's a practical matter. That's, if you like, a pragmatic matter, as he called it. And of course, it's pretty obvious that in order to get by in the world, we do have to adopt such a language. And once we adopt such a language, we get the truth of sentences like 7, from which the truth of a sentence like 6 to follow. But as I said, I'm really interested in the question of whether times exist, whether other times exist, or if you like, whether other possible worlds exist. Those are questions that bother philosophers. One way in which one might say times obviously exists is to say, well, there is a time at which Socrates drinks hemlock. That's sentence 9. Or one can say, 10, there is a world in which a detective called Sherlock Holmes lives at 221 Baker Street. These sentences, in a certain sense, could be said to be true, and since they explicitly talk about times and worlds, one might say, well, you can stop your lecture there and go home, because surely these sentences are true, and they talk about time, there is a time, there is a world. But there are philosophers who say no. One can say Socrates once drank hemlock, or is going to drink hemlock, or is now drinking hemlock. One can say that. But one shouldn't actually say there is a time at which. So 6 would be a misleading way of saying something that should be said using tense operators. My PhD supervisor was a man named Arthur Pryor, and he believed that we shouldn't say there is a time. He believed that we should do everything in what he called a tense language, in which there are operators about it was so, it will be so. And similarly, somebody might say there is a world in which a detective called Sherlock Holmes lives at 221 Baker Street. We shouldn't say that because that is misleading. We can say it might have been so that there is such a detective. So, in talking about what the, if you like, what the kind of ontology you get about times and worlds from ordinary language, I don't want to beg any questions by starting to talk about times and worlds. I want to try to look at what kind of a logical structure a language has before we are entitled to say that it quantifies over entities of a certain kind. So that we are interested in when a language, in Quine's terms, when a language is committed to certain entities. When there are enough truths in the language, enough obvious truths in the language, so that we can say this language has the structure of quantifiers which range over a domain of things, a domain of entities. So that's what I'm looking at. If we are going to study this, and if our interest is not primarily the study of one particular natural language versus one other particular natural language, if it's to be looking at the underlying logical structure of language, then we could do a lot worse than adopt a formal language, adopt one of the languages of formal logic. And let's look at first-order predicate logic. And in particular, so that we're not going to beg any questions about whether there exists other times or other worlds, let's, for temporal talk, let's have a language in which we have an operator which is called the capital P, which is 12 in your sentence, where that P at the beginning means it was once so that. It was once the case that. And F would be it is going to be so. It will one day be so. But let's look first at an important phenomenon which we can study in a formal language in ways which are much more difficult to study in a natural language. And look at the sentence number 11. A child prodigy studied at this school. It's very difficult to express the ambiguity. Because a child prodigy is somebody who, as a child, has amazing intellectual capacity. When we say a child prodigy studied at this school, we presumably mean it was once the case, this is sentence 12, it was once the case that for some X is a child prodigy and X studied at this school. Because we are probably assuming that the person was a prodigy at the time at which they studied at the school. And that is expressed in 12 by putting both child prodigy and study at the school inside the scope of the operator "it was once so that," the past operator. That's why it was called P, a past operator. It was once so that. However, if you look at predicate logic, you can also have sentence 13. 13 says there is something, there is an X. For those of you who are less familiar with predicate logic, that backwards E, the symbol that Russell used, means there is an X. X is a child prodigy, and it was the case that X studied at this school. Now that's probably unlikely, because if we are talking about a grown person, we might say they once studied at the school, but they're no longer a child prodigy. So, in the sense in which 11 is met, it probably is to be understood as 12, that it was once the case that for some X is a child prodigy and studied at the school, where the being a child prodigy and the studying at the school are things which took place of something in the past. Rather than there is something, and this something is a child prodigy, and if we're using a tensed language, is the sentences of the tense language are to be understood as holding now, that was Arthur Pryor's claim, is a child prodigy and studied at the school. But in other sentences, the preferred reading is going to be reversed. Every old man was once a baby. Well, I was once a baby, and I'm an old man now, nearly 75, I'm an old man, and I was once a baby. So 15 is true of me, and it's probably true of every old man. Every X, if X is now an old man, then sometime in the past X was a baby. But you can't say 16, there was a time in the past at which everyone who was then an old man was then a baby. Because when you're an old man, you're no longer a baby. So we're not talking about being an old man and being a baby at the same time. We're talking about being an old man and then it being true in the past. Similarly, with the future, a child prodigy will study at the school, but also, which is more important, a child prodigy might study at the school. And the reason that many philosophers are interested in what Adrian and I have called the world-time parallel is because many philosophers want to say, I'm quite happy to accept that there are other times, but I'm not happy to accept that there are other possible worlds. And part of the argument of this paper is that what we argue should exist, what philosophers ought to believe in, should be able to be read off from the logical structure of the way we think, and the logical structure of the way we think can only be read off from the logical structure of the way we talk. And that's why we have to study the logical structure of natural languages. Let's look then particularly at what sort of a logical structure will give you quantification. In first order predicate logic, a sentence like 19 will mean for every X, X is happy, which is true if everybody in the what's called domain of discourse is happy. And normally the way you motivate the understanding of the upside down A, which is known as the universal quantifier because it says for every X, every value of X makes X is happy true, which means everything, or possibly everyone, because we're probably restricting ourselves, we don't say so, restricting ourselves to humans. And people think, and you find this in introductory logic books, to understand 19, you say, well, Alice is happy, and Bruce is happy, and Clarissa is happy, and Desmond is happy, and Ernest is happy, and Frederick is happy, and so on. And you make a list of everybody in the world, you give them a name, and because every one of them is happy, we then conclude everyone is happy. But that is possibly a mistake, because you can imagine a sentence about, I don't think I have this on here, but you can imagine a sentence about subatomic particles and saying how every one of them behaves. And nobody is going to suppose that we're going to have a language where we give everyone a name. So if we want to say, when is a symbol acting like a quantifier, we've got to have some tests for it. Now, in the formal languages we use, it's easy to see, because we can establish what a quantifier is. We can say that for all x is happy in 19. We know why that's a quantifier because we've stipulated it. But when we meet an ordinary language, the ways you can express 19 are going to be very varied. Somebody told me once that people asked Russell what he thought was the principal defect of the language of Principia Mathematica, and he said he thought it was too much like English. Now, it may be that that is so, but what we can be sure of is that if we want to develop tests for quantification in natural language, we can't expect to read them off from the syntax the way we can read it off in the case of formal languages. So what sort of tests can we have to say that a symbol is a quantification symbol? Well, let's imagine that we have a language in which we've got two symbols, the upside down A and the upside down E. Let's look at some tests, some equivalences that might say, well, if we have an operator, that little tilde squiggly thing, it just means not. And so 23 says, if everything is not phi, then it's not true that something is phi. So everything is not happy. The whole universe is not happy. So that means it is not so that there exists anything in the universe which is happy. And similarly, if not everything is happy, then there must be something which is not happy. So first of all, we have a pair of operators that are related as 23 and 24 are. Second, that typically, if everything is happy, then something is happy. Now that's a little bit less clear, because what if there wasn't anything at all in the universe? So barring that strange possibility, we have 25. We also have some what are called distribution facts. If everything is phi and everything is psi, then everything is both phi and psi. That's 26. If either something is phi or something is psi, that the upside down wedge is the logical symbol for and the wedge is the logical symbol for or. I think it came originally from the Latin well or vel, which meant or, and it means or in logic, as most of you, I guess, will know. A or B means A or B, including the possibility of both. So the universal quantifier, we say, distributes over conjunction. Everything is A and everything, if everything is phi and everything is psi, then everything is both. If either something is phi or something is psi, then something is either phi or psi. Those are equivalences. Then we have implications. That horseshoe sign or hook sign means if there is something which is both phi and psi, then there is something which is phi and something which is psi. And we used to give examples to show that it doesn't work. In a logic class, you'll say some numbers are even, some numbers are odd. From that, it does not follow that any number is both even and odd. But if there is someone who's both happy and in Moscow, then there is someone who's happy and there's someone who's in Moscow. Similarly, if you have a universal one, if everything is phi or everything is psi, then everything is one or the other. But it doesn't work in the other way. Every number is odd or even. It doesn't follow that every number is odd. It doesn't follow that every number is even. What does follow is if everything is phi and something is psi, so everybody's happy and some people are in Moscow, then there's at least somebody who's happy in Moscow. Everybody's happy and someone's in Moscow, so someone is both happy and in Moscow. because whoever's in Moscow will be happy because everybody is, so that works, and again it doesn't work. So you've got a whole lot of formulae. I won't go through them all, but they are part of what defines a quantifier. But you'll notice, those of you who know a little bit of logic, will notice that there is something a little peculiar in 23 to 34. I have not used any what are called individual variables. For a certain restricted class of sentences, we don't. If I say everybody rich is happy, in standard predicate logic, you would symbolize it like 35. For all x, if x is rich, then x is happy. But of course, you don't really need the x. And that's why I wanted to say, don't get hung up on the connection with names. Don't get hung up on Alice and Bruce and Clarissa, although as we had before. If you have only a restricted class of sentences, you don't actually need the variables. The x is not really doing any work in 35. But there are quantificational sentences which need more tricks. And these tricks are ones which, in logic, require what we call individual variables. But in natural language, they almost don't. If you want to say every logician admires a linguist, 38 says, for all x, if x is a logician, then there is a y such that the y is a linguist and x admires y. So everything in the universe is such that if it happens to be a logician, then there will be a linguist. So the logician we'll call logician x, we'll call the linguist y, and x admires y. But what if I transpose the x and y at the very end of that formula to get 39 instead of 38? For all x, if x is a logician, then there is a y such that y is a logician, and y admires x. Now, we can't do anything like that in a normal natural language, but what we can do in English is use an operator, which is called passivization. We can say every logician is admired by a linguist. And there are logics, there is a branch of logic, it's called combinatory logic, which has operators which replicate bound variables in a way that is much closer to natural language. The way in natural language, we don't need the x's and y's, but we do need other tricks. We need tricks like passivization. So what we're starting to see here is in ordinary first-order predicate logic, you can read off what entities you believe in from the range of what sort of variables you have quantifying over. And there was a philosopher named W.V. Quine who said, if you want to know what a philosopher is committed to, look at their language when they have formalized it using first-order quantification theory, and then look at what their variables, the x's and y's, what sorts of things they talk about. But of course you can't do that for natural language, so you have to have other tricks. And the other tricks are that it's not that we can name all the logicians and linguists. Maybe with logicians and linguists we can name them. But if I talk about all numbers, or all points of space, or all atomic particles, or subatomic particles, I can't give them names. So if I'm to talk about them in natural language, the point about the x's and the y's is not so that we can name things in the universe. It's so that we can express things like the difference between 37 and 40. The difference between 37 and 40 requires that our language be supplemented by these variables. So the first point then is that in order to see how to do ontology, you take your natural language and you say, what kind of tricks do we need in a formal language to replicate the things that can be expressed in the natural language? Now, sometimes you can't do this. I know one particular philosopher in New Zealand who makes great fun of this. He says, look, you can't read off anything. He's a real metaphysician who says, I know what really exists, and I don't have any of this nonsense about reading it off from natural language. Because we say there is a chance of rain, don't we have chances? Or I did it for your sake. Don't we have to have sakes in the world? We have to be careful here. If you look in particular, and I would imagine something like this is true in other languages, but in English at any rate, sentence 42 is for somebody's sake. I did it for your sake. I did it because I wanted to help you. This is what we call an idiom. And every natural language, I'm sure, has idioms. And it's the mark of an idiom that the noun sake here can only refer in a very restricted range of environments. You can't say, is your sake the same as mine? How many sakes did you do it for? There's such a lot of things you can't use the noun sake for. So that we can say, look, our ontology may not have to admit sakes, because sentences about sakes don't occur in enough contexts, in enough environments for us to do anything. Chances are a little bit tricky. You can say, well, there's a better chance of rain than there is of sunshine. Or there are more things you can say about chances, and maybe chances are a bit tricky. There is in one of the articles I read, it was a book by a philosopher named Crispin Wright, who was writing about Frege, and he was talking about the whereabouts of the Prime Minister are unknown. So are there whereabouts in the universe? Well, he says, look, the whereabouts of the Prime Minister are more certain than the whereabouts of the Chancellor, so that there are, and he thought that there were enough things you could say about whereabouts to suggest there are. I mention these in order to say that the question of ontology is a tricky one. What we have to have and what we've got is enough features of the logical structure of the things we want to say to give us something which is equivalent to quantifiers and individual variables. And I want now, in the remainder of the talk, to go through certain sentences about time. Now, I'm using time and modality. They're English sentences, as I said, but I'm pretty sure that any language, whatever its tense or modal system, I'm pretty sure that any language is going to have to be able to say these things. And the first of them was discovered and studied way, way back in the 1970s. There were two philosophers working at UCLA, writing PhD dissertations with a philosopher named Richard Montague. They were Hans Kamp and Frank Black. And they were interested in sentences about tense. And one of their sentences was, one day, everyone now miserable will be happy. And if you take an ordinary tense logic, it clearly, that's 44. That sentence can't mean the same as 45, because we're not saying there's going to be a time in the future and everybody miserable at that time is happy at that time. We're actually talking about people who are now miserable and will be happy. So maybe it's a sentence like 46. No matter who X may be, if X is miserable, then X will be happy. That's closer. But suppose we're all miserable here today. You're all stuck here listening to me, and I'm miserable because you're miserable. So we're all miserable. Perhaps we're the only miserable people in the world. But I'm going to be happy tomorrow. Petra's going to be happy the next day. Kate's the next day, and so on. There's going to be some time for every one of us. There's going to be a day on which we will be happy. But there's not going to be any day on which all of us are going to be happy. You see, 44 doesn't say one day. What it says is there will be a time in the future, and everybody miserable today is going to be happy at that time. So it can't be made true because I'm going to be happy tomorrow and somebody else is going to be happy the next day and somebody else is going to be happy the day after. It's got to be, there's going to be one day at which we're all going to be happy. And that can't be expressed. This is one of the things that Hans Kant proved a long, long time ago, one of the things which can't be expressed in ordinary propositional, in ordinary predicate tense logic is that sentence 44. And it gets worse. Frank White pointed out that this is not just about the word now, because one might have said once everybody then miserable was going to be happy. See, the now, the first trick was, all right, let's imagine now is some particular moment, and some operators always bring you back to now. And Black noted that you didn't, there was also then, because you can say, it was once the case, some time ago, and we're not saying when, that everybody then miserable was going to be happy. So that the only time now comes in is now is the point we start off with, and then we go back to some time in the future, and we're talking about what happened to everybody miserable at that time in a time which is future from then. And of course, you can in fact go further. I mean, a little bit later, and you can combine them. I mean, there are complex sentences in which you would say, one day everybody who is now miserable but was, at one point I had everybody, one day everybody who is now rich but used to be, it was once the case that everybody now rich but then poor was going to admire everybody who was then rich, so that you actually have to keep more than one lot of people involved. And that's important, you see, because the point about sentences like 38 and 39 is that we have individual variables to keep track of who we're talking about. And sometimes, you might have 2, you might have 3, you might have 4. There's no natural logical limit. And similarly, if we have words like now and then, it's not just one now and one then. We might have a sentence with one now or lots of thens. And we have to keep track of which now and which then we're talking about. We can easily do it if we have quantification over times. So sentences, once everyone then miserable was going to be happy, that doesn't mean it was once the case that everyone miserable was going to be happy in the future, because for the same reason it doesn't mean that it was once so that if one person was miserable then they were going to be happy, and if another person was miserable then they were going to be happy, and if another person was miserable then they were going to be happy. It's that there was going to be a time in which all those people who were miserable then were going to be happy. And that's what you can't do with sentences like 50 or 51. What you can do, however, is to have a now operator. And a now operator, it's a weird now operator. In English, the word now always brings you back to the present. But in logic, a now just means whatever moment you happen to be at. So that the now operator in logic will be, in English, a now operator when we're talking about the present, who will then operator when we're talking about the past. And if you look at 52, I'll go through it very slowly with you. There is a time, and that time is now, and it will be so that at some time in the future, everybody who is miserable at t, and of course miserable at t means the time which is now. So you've got, first says there is a time, that time is now, and it's going to be the case that at some time in the future, all the people who are miserable at t, now that's not the people who are miserable in the future, that's the people who are miserable now. So there is a time, it's now, call that time t. Now, we go into the future, and everybody in the future who has the feature miserable at t, well that means miserable there, is happy. So the happy is inside the scope of the future operator. And so is the at t miserable, but the miserable in 52 is in the scope of the t, and the t is linked to the now. And of course, that will give you 52. And now let's move down for the moment, we can talk about 53 later, but 54 says, in some time, there was a past time, at some time in the past, there is a time, and that time is now. But of course, that's not our now, that's the past now. So it's at some time in the past, there was a time that was then the now, and it was going to be true in the future of that time. So we've gone back into the past. We've said there's a time t, and that's the time, that's the t that is now at the past. And from the future of that past time, all the people who are miserable at the t are going to be happy. Now, you may have to think a bit about these things. The next point is that every single one of these constructions that you can do for tense, you can also do for modality. So everyone actually miserable might have been happy. It doesn't mean every miserable person could have been happy. It means that it's possible that all the miserable people, it's not just that, think of the lottery. Everyone who buys a ticket and loses could have won. But it doesn't follow that it's possible that everybody who bought a ticket won. It's not possible that everybody who bought a ticket won, but it is possible for everyone who bought a ticket, it's possible that they won. So we're not talking about a possibility that everybody who did something will have something true. We can combine these, and that was the sentence, if it had been raining, it would have been possible for everyone in miserable to have been happy. And you can, perhaps I should just leave you to puzzle at that sentence number 60, but you can see there we're talking about the N means the now, which is time, and the A means the world, which is action. Now again, I'm not able to go through in a talk like this, but what we can prove is that if we have languages with enough operators like the passive operator in English, the reflexive operator, in natural language there are X loves X, we can say X loves themselves, so we have reflexive words in English. And reflexive words are when a two-place relation holds between X and X, so use the same variable. That's what we do in logic. In English we can have reflexivization. We can have passivization, which turns the order of the operators around. What can be shown is that if you have a language with enough operators to do all the things that the natural language sentences require, then the semantics for those operators enables them to be represented by explicit quantification of the times and explicit quantification of the words. So that if you claim with Quine that what we ought to believe in can be read off from what sorts of things have to be the values of the individual variables in your representation of a natural language. If the things you have to say in natural language can only be represented in a formal language which has explicit quantification, then your language is committed to these sorts of things. And that is the reason why I'm saying, as I've said, this is really addressed in a way to philosophers, because it's saying, come on, philosophers. Linguists can perhaps say, I don't know anything about metaphysics. Emmon Bach used to have what he called natural language metaphysics. He says, I don't care about what really exists. I only care about what our language claims exists. Well, he's a linguist. He doesn't have to do this. I'm a philosopher, and I want to say, look, guys, maybe when you do metaphysics, all you have got to go on is the logical structure of language. And if you want to know what your ontology has to be, you've got to look at the underlying logical structure of language, you've got to look at the things we want to say, and you've got to look at what kind of a formal logical language is needed. And one of the byproducts is going to be, at least, that's the general claim I'm making in the talk. The specific claim is I tried to illustrate it by looking at ways in which the language of tense, or the language of time distinctions, I don't want to say tense because tense is perhaps a syntactic category, the language of time distinctions and the language of modal distinctions are going to be such that you are going to have a logical parallel here, And in both cases, it looks as though the things we want to say in natural language demand that we quantify over these things. Metaphysicians of some might say, oh, but I don't think they really exist. Well, I'm prepared to give the metaphysician thing really exists. And I'll say, well, if you have some distinction between really exists, that's fine, you go away and use really exists. I'm only interested in what can be said to exist in some natural sense, and I believe that the way to look at that is to look at the underlying logical structure of natural language.
Thank you very much. We'll now have a session of questions and discussions, so please raise your hands and yes.
Thank you very much for this very interesting report, but for me it still remains unclear how can we conclude from logical structure to actual being.
Well, here's what I've said. That Quine once said you are ontologically committed to what you quantify. I think that's perhaps a misleading way of putting it. I think one way is to say, Quine will say, I hear philosophers talking about being and what really exists, and I don't really understand it. So I've got a new method. I can tell you what we quantify. If you have some different sense of real being or real whatever, all right, fine. But for those of us who don't understand what these questions about real being are, I've given you a question that I think we can answer. So I'm suggesting that in a sense, I don't want to buy into I don't want to present it by saying, look, we all know what real being is, and Quine says you can get to it via quantification. I want to say, look, we may have some idea about what real being is, but I'm not sure that we really know what we mean, what we philosophers really mean by it. So how can I say to you, all right, if you're the sort of philosopher who doesn't really know what we mean by that, I've got a trick for you. Take a lot of ordinary non-philosophical sentences, systematize their logical structure, see if you can find quantificational structure. And if these are all true sentences, and you need that logical structure to see them, that's good enough for me. And if you have some deeper notion of being, well, yes, okay.
What are the real existing entities? Are they the values of variables? Or are they the semantics of quantifiers?
Well, they will be, perhaps what the best thing to say is, look, I'm giving you tests for saying, here's what a language must look like if it has quantificational structure. And when it has quantificational structure, we express it using first-order language. We then also find that that structure can be expressed by a meta-language in which we have a domain of individuals, and we do all these things. I like Carnap's idea to say that in doing this, we have adopted a framework. We have agreed to talk to each other in this kind of way. And we know how to do it. I can show you how to do it, and this is how we do it. Now, if you want to, and to justify it, we say, well, look, I find that when I do this, when we talk this way, when we formalize it, when we then describe the formalization in the meta-language, which is just doing the same thing one level up, and then if somebody says, well, how do I understand the meta-language? There are two replies. One is, well, you just do, don't you? Or if you really don't, we go to a meta-language, and so on. We do this. This is an activity we find it profitable. I don't want to speak for Carnap here, but one way is to say, look, it's not, the world has an input. I mean, we are in a world that cooperates. When we do this, when we engage in this linguistic activity, we find that the world cooperates with it. So it's not as if all this is just made up, because the world might not have cooperated. It might have been that it might have, I mean, we adopt, in most of our human concerns, we adopt a thing language. It's not obvious how good a thing language is. People have talked about rainbows. When does one rainbow different from another? But when we use language, when we formalize it, we really adopt it as a thing language. And one reason why I suspect that philosophers have made no progress on the issue of vagueness is that I think that the world only partially cooperates with us in this way. That things like vagueness, I don't know, I know of all the 4 or 5 different ways in which philosophers have tried to say what vagueness is. I don't believe any of them works, and I think that doesn't work because I believe that the semantic framework that natural language imposes on us actually pretends that the world is more precise, if you like, than it is. But nevertheless, we get by. And so the world cooperates with us enough that the kind of semantics, and therefore the kind of ontology that we read off from it, the kind of ontology is an ontology which the world cooperates with us about. And now, if you like, that's perhaps taking a metaphysical or anti-metaphysical stance. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, another question?
I've got a question concerning, for example, your sentence number 10. Because your sentence number 10 is just a clear example of what I'm going to ask about. And this is namely that there is presumably always a risk that a particular way of expressing things is already infected with some metaphysics. And not a metaphysics innate to the language itself, but just normal metaphysics common to the philosophical community. Because, for example, this way of putting this, there is a world in which is quite clearly influenced by some metaphysics, by some philosophy, by some academic activity. Because as far as I can imagine, the so-called layman would never express it like this. And this suggests that presumably, when investigating what kinds of expressions and ontological commitments exist in ordinary language, you have to outline what counts as ordinary language, not some kind of regimented language or influenced language.
Yes, yes, I mean, I agree with a lot of that, and in fact, one of the reasons I put those sentences 9 and 10 is that I didn't want to use them for precisely those reasons. I was more interested in questions like, one day every now miserable will be happy. I assume that that is a sentence that an ordinary language speaker is probably going to understand. So there are 2 answers I can give you. One is, yes, we have to be very careful not to use sentences like 9 or 10. Sentences like, say, 8, there's no way I can jump 2 meters. That seems one that's less effective. I was assuming that there were a class of sentences where one could say that ordinary speakers of a language assume and agree on their truth. You have to be very, very careful not to move to sentences which in fact, assume this explicit metaphysics. But of course, you're also right in another way, in that it may well be that there is a metaphysics implicit in our ordinary thought, our ordinary thinking about the world. And that was linked with an answer to the previous question, because I suspect that the ordinary semantics, and here I don't mean the semantic theory of those of us who look at the logical structure of language, I mean that the kind of person, I know in New Zealand probably we haven't any, was a certain sort of radio interviewer who's going to say, give me a yes or no answer. Is he a bad man? Is he not a bad man? And in fact, you start to say, well, in some ways yes, in some ways no, I want yes or no. And I actually firmly believe that the ordinary nature of language is actually a nature that makes the world seem far more precise and give it far more metaphysical structure than we're really entitled to. So I've got 2 answers for you. One is, yes, if you are going to engage in this technique, you had better make sure that every one of the sentences you use is something that a non-philosopher would be prepared to understand and accept as true or false. And I agree with you that sentences like 9 and 10, particularly 10, is something where, and in fact, many philosophers, Arthur Pryor, I believe, would have said 9 just isn't true because he didn't believe in instants, he didn't believe in times. But he did believe that Socrates once drank hemlock. And if you ask an ordinary person, was there ever a philosopher who drank hemlock? Well, they might not know, but it's not philosophical. So I think in part there are certainly sentences that exhibit too much philosophical or semantic theory to be useful for the purposes I have in mind. And there is also the danger, which I think is equally real, that ordinary sentences that ordinary speakers do understand may well be infected with more metaphysics than we are literally entitled to.
Is it what we are trying to reveal actually by investigating the language? Maybe we are looking for the innate metaphysics already present in the language. Maybe this is what your proposed method or hint-term method is aiming at finding the primordial innate metaphysics underlying language.
Right, and I suppose there's too much of a logical positivist in me to be comfortable with saying this, because I'm not sure that I know what this primordial metaphysics is. I know what it is to say the world cooperates with people who use a language in which quantification works like so. And therefore, in that sense, I'm happy to say, well, so-and-sos exist. Because if the world cooperates in a language which allows us to say, where anyone who wanted to come to this lecture would have had to come to Moscow to do it. If the world cooperates in such a way that that sentence is true, then we can say there is something about the world that means we can use a language which has a structure of a certain kind, and in that sense you can say something is being revealed about what is really there, namely, the world cooperates with us when we use a language in this way. But if you then say that, look, I'm a seeker after real truth or I'm whatever, then I will have to say, look, I'm not terribly comfortable with that. And for those who are not comfortable with that, I'm certainly offering something which can, I think, be read off with the aid of logical and linguistic theory. If there is some deeper sense, I guess I would put the burden of proof on someone there. As I say, this probably just reveals the fact that whatever may be the defects of logical positivism, there is a lot about its aim which I find very attractive. And the positivists, remember, the logical positivists were saying it's not that we disagree with this metaphysics, it's that we don't understand what kind of a claim is being made when somebody says this. And I'm saying, well, you can believe that and still, in a way, do metaphysics. You'd have to do it this way.
Okay, any other question? I'll see you now.
I just wanted to understand this part. What exactly I now operate as? Because, it is objectable that in many contexts now refers to the moment of the utterance, though there are contexts where it refers to other times. But if we talk ontological, so highly intuitively, after all, just don't have enough information to grasp it. What is the function of this operator?
Well, there are a number of... Going back to someone like Prior didn't like to quantify over times, but if you imagine that we can quantify over times, take a sentence like it's now 4 o'clock, so that the NT would really mean 4 o'clock is now. But of course, it's not like now, because you might say, it's now, it's actually a little bit past it, so although 4 o'clock is not now, 4 o'clock used to be now, in a certain sense. Now, in one sense, of course, that's, in English, that's nonsense. We can't say 4 o'clock used to be now, because only 12 minutes past 4 is now. But the way I was using that now operator was to say, look, 12 minutes past 4 is now. 12 minutes ago, 4 o'clock was now. And that's what's meant here by that now predicate. Because I want to say something like, it used to be now, and that's why we normally in English would say, we would use the word then. But so when we say it used to be now, in English we say it was so then. So that we are, the now just means whatever moment you happen to be at. And now we happen the minutes past 4. But some time ago it was now 4 o'clock was now in some sense of now. And now that's why the predicate now in those formal languages is not exactly like the way the word now uses in English, and I expect in many other languages. But logically, it simply means that if you believe in a tense language, you have to believe that there is a single moment that is now, but for every moment that is now, that moment will one day not be now, but it will be the case then that it used to be now. And then there will be moments that are not yet now, but one day will be now, and so on. That's the kind of language. Now, it's hard to say it in a tense language, but it's not hard to give the meaning of, if you believe that sentences are true or false at moments of time, then now is a predicate that now is true of t only at time t, and now is true of t dash only at t dash, and now is true of t double dash only at t double dash. That's the way that word now is used. I was using it there because because there are philosophers who say tense is more basic than time, and therefore now is somehow real. But even those philosophers have to be able to say, and Prior, I think, would, if he was prepared to quantify over instance, he would be prepared to do it, I think, and in some of his works he does. He would want to say, well, look, by this used to be now, I don't mean the sense in which that can't be said in many natural languages, but I mean the logical sense in which every moment, every past moment, used to be now, and every future in that moment will one day be now. But only one moment is now. And you can, I think, if you're prepared to talk in a tense language, I think you can make sense of that. And I'd like to think that you can make sense of that in a way which does not presuppose the metaphysics to begin with. Sorry?
Will be now. The time of the end of everything.
Will time end?
Will it be now?
The moment, the last moment of
Everything
universe.
ends.
Well, there might be a moment which is now, and there'll be no. Do you mean that once time is ended, there will be nothing that is even now or even used to be now?
Yes, once in the
Well,
time of the end of the existence.
Well, sure. I mean, if after, I mean, it depends. If you say time ends, it depends on. I mean, someone like, well, I don't know what one would say. If you say that time has ended, then you can't really say what would happen after that. because there will be no after that. So there is nothing to be now. But that doesn't mean there is nothing now to be now. I mean, even talking about time ending, it looks like saying one day there will be no more time, but that needs a lot of unpacking so that it doesn't mean there is going to be a time at which it is not now. When that time is now, it's not now. You've got to be careful to make sure that you find that the formulation of that is consistent. And you might well say, well, of course, you can't. It's even hard to say if something is now true. I think it's always going to be that it was once true. And if you haven't said, what about when time is ended? Well, you're not really allowed to say when time is ended, because that looks like a time after time is ended. So you have to be very careful to say, what are we to say once there is no time? Because it's very hard not to talk about it in terms which make it look contradictory. So I'm not saying you can't do it, but it's just that if we're talking about ending time, I think that there is certainly no bother to producing a formal language in which there is a moment such that there is no moment after that. And it's true of that moment that if something is then true, there will be a moment in which it used to be true. That certainly will be. There will be some normal laws of tense logic which will fail at the last moment of time.
But do we actually in natural languages mean time moments, saying now?
You mean?
I mean, does it correspond to our practice of using this natural language word now? Do we refer to moments? Just talking intuitively, not formally.
Oh, right. Oh, you mean that normally when we use, this is another thing that I have not suggested. I have talked as though temporal natural language discourse talks about truth at a single instant. But of course, there are certain constructions. For example, if you say, in English, we have what is called the imperfective tense or the present continuous tense. We could say somebody was crossing the road. And of course, to cross the road is not something that happens at a single instant. And the semantics for the continuous present is a tricky one because we have sentences, and these have been discussed by linguists, and that one can say that Alice was crossing the road when she was struck, when she was hit by a bus. But then you can't say there was an interval of road crossing, at least not in the actual world. You have to say somehow there was an interval of road crossing, but not in the actual world, and it started off in the actual world. And then philosophers have said, but look, we're imagining if the bus hadn't been there, and everything had proceeded in the normal way, she would have gone across the road. But one might say Alice was walking to her death when something happened. See, so that there's been a lot of work there, and I think that it's true that a lot of what I have said in this talk needs quite a lot of refinement to take care of what people have sometimes called interval semantics, where the truth of many tense constructions in natural language is going to assume that the unit of truth is not a single instant of time, but is probably a time interval. And that means that the tense logic you're going to get is going to be a great deal more complicated than anything I've got here. And in this paper, I suppose in this paper I have traded on the assumption that the phenomena I have been dealing with are not going to be too badly affected by the move to interval semantics, but that's perhaps a dangerous assumption for me to have made.
More questions? Yes.
Just a little remark, which is perhaps related to the previous question, again concerning 52 to 54. Here you don't use the full power of quantification over time, because if you can notice that exist t goes together with nt. So there exists time t, which is now, and some phi holds. So perhaps here a more appropriate construct would be a construct from what is called a hybrid logic, a construct of binder. So when we utter this sentence, we just say, let's call the current moment of time t, just name it, and then evaluate the whole sentence in which t occurs at some points. So this is rather a hybrid tense logic rather than quantification over 10 times.
Yeah, there is a question here, and I agree with you that if you can show that natural language, that all the sentences that natural language demands can be expressed in a logic that is weaker than full quantification, then I will agree with you that then there will be the question, what should you say here? One thing that does seem to be true, you're quite right here, is that the quantifier there, that the t that comes after now is paired with the t in the square brackets. What would need to be shown, I know that many systems of hybrid logic do involve are weaker than full quantification. What I'm less convinced by is that the respects in which they are weaker will do everything that natural language demands. So that the issue is not, can you develop a hybrid logic that is weaker than full quantification, but is this going to be good enough for everything that natural language demands? And that I'm a little bit less sure of. The other question, of course, would be, well, the other interesting question would be, the other way of approaching it, of course, would be to start with hybrid logic and look at what additional operators you're going to have to add to it before you get full quantification. And so that the technique would be to say, all right, let's look at the operators that you need to add to get full quantification, and then let's look at whether there are natural language which sentences which demand these operators. And that would be the area where you would have to look carefully. Now, there may be more work there than I've seen. What work I have seen is often there is a different respect in which people might like to use hybrid logic, particularly logicians in the computer sciences, where they might say, look, we want languages which have the minimal logical power to do certain jobs we need to do in computing. Because you can understand that if you have to pay for the power of the logic, then it's going to be cheaper to have a logic that does fewer things. And what work I've seen, and I can't pretend that I'm up to date with all the work, particularly the connection with linguistics. What work I've seen is more along the lines of, for certain computational purposes, we can get a cheaper logic which doesn't do all of quantification. And that's a very, very important role, I believe, for hybrid logic. The issue is going to be how cheap can your logic be to get the semantics that natural language demands?
More questions? Is there anyone who has not asked a question who would want to do it? This is the time. Yes. Just
Would you treat spatial pronouns or just regular pronouns or in natural language in the same way as you've dealt with now in other temporal things?
Well,
Like here, there.
well, yeah, you can certainly, I mean, in fact, from the point of view of pure logic, you can actually have a certain kind of indexable semantics in which your whole language is simply a propositional language, and a predicate is something true at an index, so that a two-place predicate is something true at a double index, and so on. We can do that. It's not hard to say the only, from the logical perspective, the only syntax we need are propositional operators, and you do everything in terms of indices. And pronouns then become more like operators, certainly reflexive, that every logician loves themselves. Everything moves itself. Their itself looks more like an operator which converts a transitive verb into an intransitive verb. So that the part of those questions are going to become much more questions for linguistics, to look at how particular natural language use these things. That are the pronouns in natural language, pronouns often play a role that seems to be connected with variables, but do they play the role in the way variables do, or do they play the role more like operators? And that is an interesting question for the syntax of particular languages. So yes, I think the things that I've said, the things that I've said about times and words, where I've said, look, let's look at a language in which there is no syntactic quantification over times and words. We can do it for other things. And I hinted at that in, like, every logician is admired by a linguist, every logician admires themselves, and so on. That there are a lot of things, whenever a cardinal meets a cardinal, he blesses him, these kinds of sentences, or donkey sentences, or whatever. There are many kinds of complex constructions in natural language where we can get to, we kind of know what sentence of predicate logic would represent them, but trying to get from the syntax of the natural language to the actual sentence of the quantification logic is in fact quite a tricky one. And the study of pronouns will come into that. I know Prior he had a paper called Egocentric Logic, where he wanted to say that we really need a person index. And in fact, there's a famous article by David Lewis called They Say Knowledge, where he says, look, somebody thinks he's Hume. Now, to think one is Hume, I mean, only Hume. Hume think that you could say, well, when Hume says, I think I'm Hume, he thinks Hume is Hume, but that's a necessary truth. And if somebody thinks he's Hume, it's not a contradiction, because most of us who think we're Hume are wrong, but not all of us. Hume was right when he thought he was Hume, but for the rest of us, when we thought we were Hume, we were wrong. And Lewis says, well, think of I am Hume as a sentence that is true of Hume and false of everyone else. And is that so very different from it's 9 o'clock? I mean, I can say, oh, I believe it's 4:30. I believe I'm Max Cresswell. I believe it's... And Lewis tried to show how these have a very similar structure. And John Perry had an example of somebody who says, I believe it's now 9 o'clock. I believe the meeting is in 10 minutes. And one person thinks that it's, say the meeting is supposed to be at 10 o'clock, And one person says, I believe it's in 10 minutes. And they say this at 9 o'clock, and they're wrong because they think it's 9 o'clock. The other person knows that it's 9 o'clock, but thinks that the meaning was scheduled for 9 o'clock. So you have two different sorts of ignorance there. So there is some evidence that perhaps we should have times and worlds and maybe people and other things. But from the point of view of logic, you can think of Tarski's idea of, think of it, the Tarski analysis of a predicate is a formula true at a sequence of objects, namely the objects that satisfy the predicate. So from the point of view of logic, you can have sentences and operators, but that may or may not be a plausible syntax for any particular language. And exactly how pronouns come in is going to be, I would suggest, as much a syntactic as a logical matter.
Yes, I wanted to ask you a question about your example 44. One day everyone now miserable will be happy. Yeah. We looked at representation in 46 and we said that it was not good enough because it can be the case that the time when every individual is happy can be different. But cannot someone say, look, this formula does not demand that the time is different. It can be still the same time. Cannot someone say that this is still the representation for 44, but only one particular case when this formula is true?
Oh yes, I mean, I don't want to make a claim about whether or not that English sentence can mean 46. It possibly can. My claim would be that it doesn't have to, and in certain cases, I think you could say, take the lottery case. It might have been that everyone who bought a ticket won. And I think there is a sense in which that's false. But everyone who bought a ticket might have won. Now, my claim would be that not that that English sentence can't mean 46. My claim is more than surely the meaning, the question is this: is the meaning that I've highlighted in 52 a possible meaning for 44? Because if it's a possible meaning, then one will need something more than predicate logic to represent it. Now, you'd have to make a pretty strong claim that meaning is just not possible. Not is it the most natural meaning. I mean, my view about the relation between logic is that the logical structure of the language is often going to set limits to what in principle can be said. It's then a matter for syntax to devise rules to say, look, this reading is going to be a very unnatural one. The other examples, the ordinary quantification examples, everybody loves someone, there is someone everyone loves. A long time ago, back in the 1970s, I tried to concoct scenarios in which everyone loves someone could have, you set up the story so that everyone loves something. You might talk about a pop singer in this. Do you think there are some pop singers that everyone loves? Oh, everyone loves someone. There could be, if you set the thing up. So the argument would be, look, whether or not a natural language sentence has that meaning or naturally has that meaning is one issue. The issue for me is that meaning a meaning which a natural language could reasonably be expected in certain circumstances to be able to address? So that would be, but I certainly don't, I agree with you there, I do not want to claim that 44 can never have the meaning of 46. That could well be. And if you looked at my examples about child prodigy, like the 11 and 14, those were cases where both readings were logically available, but one reading seemed plausible in the case of the child prodigy example, 11, and a different reading seemed more plausible in the case of the old man reading, in the case of 14. The logic doesn't distinguish that. Now, possibly, I mean, how much of that syntax, pragmatics, whatever, there certainly could be. What branch of linguistics should address that kind of thing is certainly an interesting and important question. It's a question in the nature of linguistic theory to what part of linguistics, if any, should tell you that 12 rather than 13 is the natural reading of 11, but 15 rather than 16 is the natural reading of 14. Is that or is it not a question for linguistics? Now, I don't want to pronounce on that at all. But, so that's what I'd say about 44.
I'm a person who did not ask a question, and I would like to ask one. This is a question about how effective this suggestive character of language about what exists can be. We seem to be able to quantify or at least use as a referential very many expressions in natural language. I can count 15 people in this room. Then I can count, and I'm talking about people. Well, yes, well, people who may say that they exist. But then I can also count, like 1.5 of a person. And then that'll give me 10 1.5s of people here. And then we can also refer to even to parts of idiomatic expressions. And I have examples like that they mostly Russians right in my mind right now. So, how suggestive is that? We don't seem to accept things as those parts of idiomatic expressions and things like that as suggestive as to what exists. But they are used as referential, or seem to be used as referential in natural language.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. Firstly, in one way, I suppose you might say the hidden agenda of this talk is to sort of, if you like, debunk the importance of ontology. Because I think that in a certain sense, the ontological commitment of natural language is profligate, and it's important that it should be so. So that metaphysical question, in a way, it doesn't bother me that natural language, or that the underlying logical structure of language can allow many, many things. And then perhaps the metaphysical importance is not what is the domain of quantification, but what one might say, well, certain things in the domain of quantification have a metaphysical importance that other things don't have. So it's not quantification or existence where it's at. It's that, for example, some things in our domain of discourse are things that we humans can perceive. Middle-sized objects of a certain kind, and those are important to us. And most of the words that we use in semantics are words describing people's relation to the things we can perceive, and so on. So that the kind of ontology that is presupposed here is very, very profitable. Now, the other question, I agree, is a much harder one. At what point can you say that the occurrence of an expression is so idiomatic that you can't derive quantification structure from it? I tried to give a kind of, I tried to develop a series of tests where you first of all had general principles, which were like 23 up to 34. You then had certain sort of operators that allow you to transpose variables. There are tests that tell you when you have enough, what logicians call them combinators, enough operators in the language to enable you to replicate full quantification. And it may be that certain expressions, certain idiomatic expressions, are not ones for which natural language is going to give you a clear answer. But that doesn't bother me too much, because it's like what I was suggesting about vagueness. I think that the semantics of natural, the nature of natural language, we actually pretend that the syntax and semantics of natural language is more precise than it is. And in particular, it may be that you can say, is this expression, when we look at how we use this expression, is it so idiomatic? Is the range of its contents so restricted that we can't get variable binding out of the constructions in which it appears? Now, there may be a lot of borderline cases. In the examples I gave you in English, sakes, there probably aren't such things as sakes, because you can only do it for so-and-so's sake. All those can never occur without a genitive there. And that, of course, means you can quantify. You're really thinking of the phrase for x's sake, and the only individual is x there. That looks like that's the case. A chance of rain, that's a trickier one. Can you talk about the same chance? But is it trickier than, say, a rainbow, where is it the same rainbow you see in ice? Can we both see the same rainbow? We can't. What is the nature of a rainbow? Is it something we don't quantify over, or is it something we quantify over, but we all see different rainbows and so on? We can talk about the same rainbow. So that there are a lot of cases where the tests may not be precise enough. And in those cases, then we have to look at, but it'll be, are the constructions in which this phrase can occur such as enable you to represent its quantification? That is to say, are the things you want to say such that whatever mechanism you use that's adequate to saying them is going to be a mechanism that is strong enough to define quantification? And there may be borderline or difficult cases. Now, I'm not sure whether that answers what you had in mind.
It does. Are there any questions for someone who is not yet asked? Yes.
Just a quick question to understand it. So there is a classic example of the sentence. This sentence is not true. I think it starts kind of Greek is. You don't have it. It's just the sentence. This sentence is not true.
Oh, you mean the
the classic. Yeah.
It
doesn't have any logical meanings.
Yeah, I haven't discussed that. I mean, in some cases, I once, when I did discuss it, the simplest case I could think of was, let's imagine a language in which there is a one-symbol sentence, and I called it kappa. And I said, I'll give you the semantics of kappa. The semantics of kappa is that kappa is a sentence, and its semantics is such that it is a sentence which is true if it's not true. And my conclusion was, that doesn't stipulate a meaning for any sentence. Because you're saying, I was doing it in possible world terms, I was saying the kappa means the semantic value of kappa, namely is a set of possible worlds. The semantic value of kappa is that a world W is in V kappa, if and only if you like, W is not in kappa. And I said there can't be any such thing. You can't assign to any sentence that meaning. Just as there can't be a set of all sets not members of themselves. Any more than there can be a barber who shaves those and only those who don't shave themselves. The problem with self-referential paradoxes, and I'll take the set theory as an example, we know there can be no set of all sets not members of themselves. Why then is it a paradox? It's a paradox because there seem to us to be plausible principles that say there ought to be such a sentence. So the way to understand the paradox is to say, well, what typically people do is to say, we'd like there to be such a sentence, or we'd like there to be a set which contains those and only those things which are not members of themselves, but of course there can't be. So our set theories which should give us as many sets as we can possibly have, except that. Now the problem there, I think, is why do we want this to be so? All we know for a fact is there can't be such a sentence. Or something. All we know for a fact is that there can't be a set that has as its members things that are only not members of themselves, or all members that are not members of themselves. Similarly, we can't have a sentence which is so false in the way it is. We can't have a sentence that says of itself that it's false, nor is it clear that we can have a sentence that says of itself that it's true, in the sense that you can't specify what would count. Supposing you adopt a truth conditional theory of meaning and say, call the sentence kappa. This sentence says of itself that it's true. Under what circumstances will kappa be a true sentence? Well, it'll be a true sentence if it's a true sentence. But every sentence is a true sentence if it's a true sentence. So that specification, while it's not contradictory, does not uniquely give the meaning of one sentence rather than any other sentence. And if that's right, you are not giving, if you say this sentence is true, meaning it says of itself that it's true, the question is why? The question is that you are not giving a specification. Now, it looks as though you are, because you're making it up compositionally out of this sentence is a phrase that means something, is true, seems to be something, and it looks like you're putting together things that are individually meaningful. But these paradoxical examples show that you can't consistently you're not specifying meanings, you are not completely and consistently specifying meanings when they have the consequence. So what are you doing? And that's the question there is, what can you say about this sentence is true or this sentence is false? We know that there can be no meaning specification which satisfies one, and every meaning satisfies the other, so it's not a unique one. The question then is, well, what is it that makes us think that we have specified a meaning in these cases? And then you have to look carefully at what a truth predicate looks like, what a falsity predicate looks like, what you can do, what you can't do, and so on. So I don't have a particular answer, but I'm simply saying that in these cases, we know that certain things we want to have, we can't have, and so two questions arise. One, how close can we get? And the other is a question, why do we think we should have these things? Because the set theory paradox is interesting because it looks like we do want to say there ought to be a set whose members are those and only those things which are not members of themselves. But nobody wants to say there ought to be a barber that shaves those and only those people who don't shave themselves. So the paradox is only, why do we think there should be such a set? Why do we not think there needs to be such a barber? Why is the barber not a paradox? Why is the set theory a paradox? Well, it's a paradox because we have to work out why it is we think there ought to be such a set, and why it is we don't think there ought to be such a barber. And the same, I think, is true of the semantic paradoxes. But I don't, in this talk, I have very little to say. I have no view myself about what to say about the semantic paradoxes. So the answer is yes, I haven't said anything about the semantic paradoxes, and I don't have anything to say about them. But something has got to be said about them because they're there, and therefore they're going to be a problem for anybody's semantics.
Yes.
can you just quickly, well, once again, spell out your overall meta-ontological stance? What about more traditional kinds of arguments appealing to scientific theories or intuitions philosophers think are? Are they legitimate at all?
Well, here's an example. Nominalists seem to be people who believe only individuals exist and persons don't. And what would they mean by individuals? Well, one argument for nominalists would be they mean things that you can name and touch and are in sensory contact with. So I would say no, it's legitimate, but I would prefer to reconstrue them as saying that of the things we quantify over, there is a certain subclass of things which we are in sensory contact with. And what metaphysicians do might perhaps, from the point of view of a logical positivist, a charitable logical positivist might say, what these people are really doing is highlighting the importance of a certain subclass of the things we quantify. And that is a legitimate task, but that's the charitableness in the logical positivism. Well, they're not really doing what they think they're doing, though they are doing something which is legitimate. And they're explaining, look, these are things we can actually give names to. These are things that we are in contact with. These are things which are important to us. They're giving a list of those things. So your answer, it's a yes and no answer. You're saying, am I poo-pooing traditional metaphysics? And in one sense you could say, yes, I am. But if you're poo-pooing something, you've got to have an account of what these people are doing. If somebody says that such and such, the sensible world is not part of reality, then one at least has to have a good account of what somebody who says the sensible world is part of reality is saying. And now, of course, the positivist is not going to deny that, but if somebody says, well, look, there are no numbers, but there are people, one might say, well, look, and Carnap, I think, might say something like this, look, one could elect to say, I am not going to use the number language, but I'm going to use the person language. And if I agree that I'm not going to use the number language, the question is, can I say all the things I want to say? If somebody says that persons exist but numbers don't, and that person says, nevertheless, I'm going to use the number language, and I'm going to use the person language, but I say the person language has a reality that the number language doesn't. That's a little bit, it seems very easy to say, well, aren't you simply saying, look, we can use the number language with the person language, but we're attaching a certain kind of importance or reality to the person language that we're not attaching to the number language, which is rather like saying persons are important to us in a way in which numbers are not. Persons have all sorts of things which are crucial for our language, in that we say, well, we can interact with them, we can do these things with them. So there would be a role for metaphysics, but the role would be, well, look, now I'm not now talking here about the reply that I gave before. The reply that I gave before was, look, you metaphysicians may talk your talk, but we positivists don't understand what you're saying. I'm thinking about a charitable positivist who hears the metaphysicians talk and say, look, they seem to be engaged in a language game in which there are rules. They seem to be doing something sensible. How can I, consistent with my positivist principles, charitably construe what they're doing? Well, I can say they're attaching a certain kind of reality or importance to these things that they're not attaching to these things. And all right, I'm prepared to understand their word real. To me, it's just a predicate that's true of some things but not others, but I can understand what they say when they say people are real but numbers are not. Real is the predicate they apply to people but don't apply to numbers. Now, I quantify both these things, But I can understand a predicate which applies only to people and not to numbers. And that's what I understand them to be doing. So that would be the kind of reply that would at least allow me to, for example, supposing I was a logical positivist, but was interested in the history of philosophy, and I wanted to describe the medieval debate between the realists and the nominalists. Obviously, I've got to be able to make sense of what they were debating about in some sense. And it is, of course, difficult. I mean, this is one of the things Quine, in his essay on what there is, talks about how the person who doesn't believe in certain things is a disadvantage of the person who does, because the person who does can just say, well, I believe in all these kind of things, and if you say, I don't believe in all these kind of things, it's very hard to say what sort of thing you don't believe. So I'm happy to say there is the language, there is the language framework in which we make this distinction. Carnap does say we can have universals in our language. Carnap does claim, I know what it is like to use a language in which there are universals, and I think it's and I think it's a useful language. Now, maybe the dispute between realists and nominalists is really a dispute about whether we ever need the more powerful language, whether it's profitable to have the more powerful language. That may have been Carnap's dispute. Or it may be to say, well, look, I believe that we quantify over both things, and I look at one group of people who uses the word real in this restricted way, and another group who doesn't. And it looks like they are debating there. But then is it a real debate? So Carnap would probably say it's not a genuine debate in some sense. But yes, you're right. We have got to make sense of what people are doing who think there is a debate where we might say there is no debate. We've got to be able to describe what it is they think they're doing, even if it's not something we know. So yeah, you've got to, and I've given some suggestions, but yes, it's a real problem what you do in describing what people are doing when they are engaged in a metaphysical dispute, which you're inclined to think is not a genuine dispute.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Cresswell. I guess we will end our session for today. If there are no questions. Thank you.